All right, good evening. I want to begin by giving my personal thanks to Peter Steinfeld and Jonathan Ehrlich here at Buena Vista University for making possible this opportunity to address you. Tonight's topic of human trafficking is something that we generally shy away from in polite society, so this sort of forum is necessary for counter-trafficking activists to educate people, and for that, I want to thank you all very much for coming. My profound gratitude goes out to my friend Matthew Friedman, the former director of the United Nations Interagency Program on Human Trafficking, and who is currently working in the Mekong Club. Much of what I have to say here is taken from his lectures. And also I'd like to thank the UNIAP and their staff, Daniel Walker and his team at the rescue organization of Invader. Again, many of the stories come from his book, God in the Brothel. And I'd like to thank the Women and Children's Shelter Hagar International, the staff at Worldwide Documentaries who produced Not My Life. I thank them all for their material and their inspiration that they have provided to make this lecture possible. This presentation is dedicated to them, their staff, and most especially the people they help. Before I dive in, I'd love to see a quick show of hands. How many of you think you have an idea here as to what human trafficking basically is? It's modern-day slavery. It happens all over the world, that sort of thing. Okay, that's a pretty good start then. And after this presentation, I'd love to hear how some of you came to be concerned about this subject, because one of the questions I inevitably get asked is, how in the world did I ever get involved with it? And to that I would say, be careful if you ever try to write a book. You never know what doors that will open. A few years ago I started one. The plotline involved slavery, and being the sort of person who likes to get things right and realistic, I did some serious research into human trafficking, and I was completely unprepared for what I found. Up until then, I'd had this vague awareness that modern slavery was out there, but I held the same common attitudes most people do. I figured that there wasn't anything I could do about it. It's a problem for the police. It must be a pretty rare thing since I didn't hear more about it in the news. The reality I discovered in my research is that widespread slavery didn't end with the United States Civil War. It's alive and well. In fact, it is found in virtually every country on Earth. And according to the United Nations, it affects roughly 21 million people at any given time. It is worth about $32 billion in profits annually for the criminals. What is modern slavery? Very broadly, it is the loss of personal freedom. It often involves physical or mental abuse, and always it involves the loss of fair wages. It's a severe crime. And you can think of it this way. We get upset at being held up by airport security or in traffic for half an hour. We feel sad or angry if somebody calls us names or hits us. We get really mad if somebody steals our wallet or purse. But slavery is much worse than this. Imagine a life where you lose the freedom to leave a situation that you don't like. Imagine the stress and fear if you have somebody threatening to hurt you or your loved ones if you don't do what they want. And imagine what it would mean for you to work a 60, 80, or 100-plus hour work week in lousy conditions at a mind-numbing job for months or years and not get paid for it properly, if at all. All those things are a part of slavery today. Now, just a few quick notes before I go on. If at any point you have questions, please raise your hand. I'll call on you at the first opportunity. For privacy reasons, the imagery here doesn't necessarily show a victim, and the names have been changed to protect privacy. But bear in mind that all of these stories have actually happened and are happening right now to someone. Something else is that I'm going to spend half of my time here tonight telling you stories. Because if you're like me, I can give you all the facts and statistics in the world, but it won't resonate with you emotionally by sharing stories. And to take that idea one step further, I'm going to tell you these stories as if you were in them. I want to invite you to identify with what these people go through, because once you've opened yourselves up to that kind of emotional vulnerability, you'll find that you have to do something for them. And that is really the whole point of this talk, to inspire you to help these people. With that in mind, the first real case scenario I have is about a young girl and you. In this story, you're a healthcare worker trying to fight the AIDS epidemic, and you're patrolling the brothels in Mumbai, India to ensure that they have condoms available. You go to the umpteenth brothel of the day with your police escort. The rotted-out building looks like the set of a horror film. Like all the other brothels, it smells of sweat and musk, and maybe you're imagining it, but you think you detect an odor like chlorinated swimming pool water which you know would actually be the scent of semen wafting from the discarded condoms. And as you go about your business, asking questions and looking around, from out of nowhere, a small figure runs up to you and literally wraps her arms around you. You look down in surprise to see a little Nepalese girl, no more than 11 or 12, with shoulder-length black hair and wearing a plain black sundress. The fact that her undeveloped body is at least 4 sizes too small for the clothes emphasizes just how out of place she is there. What captures your attention the most, however, are her light brown eyes, which stare up at you with a wide, terrified expression. She tells you in a regional language that you happen to speak, "Save me. Save me. They are doing terrible things to me." You blink for a second or two in shock at what is happening. Your first thought is, how in the world did a kid get into this place, and what kind of person would buy sex from her? Then you collect your wits and turn to the police officer who came with you, and you say, "Okay, we're going to take this child out of here." He replies, "No, we're not." Certain that you haven't heard him right, you say, "What do you mean, why not? That we're not? Oh, you're a police officer." And he says, "Because if we try to leave here with her or call for help, the brothel keepers will kill us." Your mind starts racing. Do you attempt to escape with the child and risk that the police officer is right? Do you risk staying with the girl while he goes for backup? Just how likely is it that the brothel keepers would get away with kidnapping and murdering you while your escort is away? And then it dawns on you that for all you know, either this policeman or his superiors may be in the pocket of the brothel owners, and help might never arrive. You argue with the policeman a bit more, but it doesn't take long before you decide that the uncertainties are too great and you opt to retreat. When you come back with more police, the girl, of course, is gone, and your life is changed forever. For the rest of your days, you will be ashamed and haunted by the knowledge that you failed to help this precious and utterly helpless young child. You know that almost certainly soon after your encounter she was severely beaten and likely brutally raped to deter her from ever attempting to escape again. She may have even been murdered as an example to the others in the brothel. If she survived her punishment, you know that she would have continued to serve in commercialized sexual exploitation for many more years to come until her body became either too worn out or too sick to be profitable. Chances are very high that she'd contracted HIV and died of AIDS within a decade of your meeting. I tell you this depressing story for several reasons. First, in one form or another, this is how activists are born. It happens in that moment when all of a sudden you can see that something horrific is out there and you can't turn away from it. You have to do something about it. Another reason I tell you this story is to drive home the point that talking about modern slavery isn't some fun little academic exercise as some of the sex buyers I've spoken with treat it. The girl was real. The health care worker who met her is a friend of mine, and I can tell you that he has never recovered from his encounter. In fact, he's devoted his entire life ever since to fighting slavery. He's helped many, many people, but he always thinks of his failure with this little girl. He was so quick to abandon her, in fact, that he never even learned her name. To give the child's memory some small measure of the dignity stolen from her, he and I agreed that we should call her something befitting who and what she was. We decided to name her Amelia, which in Nepalese means priceless. As with so many other slaves around the world, Amelia's life was one with inestimable value that someone bought and sold for their own selfish profit, that someone used for their own selfish pleasure. And while my friend failed to protect her, we have failed as a global society to do whatever is necessary to protect others like her. My thesis for you tonight is that slavery happens because we let it happen. Like wolves stealing from a flock of sheep, the exploiters will do what they do because they can. The question is, what are the shepherds doing? To paraphrase Josh McIntosh of the International Justice Mission, I submit, we are too concerned with trivia when we should be dealing with the greater tragedies of our world. We just don't care about these people because they aren't standing in front of us screaming for help. Amelia's story is just one kind of slavery that exists today. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions about human trafficking is that all modern slavery is sex trafficking, and that's not the case. Sex trafficking accounts for only a quarter of all forms of slavery. It's just that sex trafficking gets talked about the most because of the visceral moral repugnance we feel towards it, and it deserves to get a lot of attention, so we'll talk a lot more about it later. But next, I want to speak to you about the other three-quarters of human trafficking, which is labor trafficking. Now, a recurring theme in human trafficking is that it involves migrant workers. Migrants are people who move from less developed areas to more developed areas looking for work. Now, note, this does not always involve crossing borders. People often get trafficked within their own countries, and also this does not always involve illegal immigration. Legal immigrants can get trafficked too. And for the rest of this presentation, I'll focus mostly on the Southeast Asia region because that's where most of the organizations I am hooked into primarily operate. A lot of migrants will flow into Thailand from the surrounding countries because it's more prosperous there. So in this next story, we're going to talk about Thai fishing boats. Imagine you're a Cambodian traveling to Thailand and you're interested in finding some type of work. You look for a few days, but then you run out of money. Eventually someone notices your situation and says to you, "Hey friend, here's some money. I see that you need some help." You accept the money. The debt has been developed, and that's the big hook in human trafficking because it will be used as the excuse for all the exploitation that is to follow. Next, the trafficker says, "Oh, by the way, I have this job down by the ocean. Why don't you come with me, and I'll set you up, and that way you can pay me back." So you go down to the shore, you're put on a fishing boat. They take your immigration paperwork for safekeeping, and you go out to sea. 4 years go by, and you don't touch land once. You eat rice and fish every single day, no fruits and vegetables. You work 16 to 19 hours a day. To keep you moving, your captors give you stimulants, which make you sloppy and prone to injury. And gradually you notice a pattern about the treatment of your fellow slaves. If they get sick, they get thrown off the boat. If they get injured, they're thrown off the boat. If they complain too much, they're thrown off the boat. If the captain just doesn't like them, they are thrown off the boat. So there's a lot of murder involved in this type of situation. 4 years of this, you finally come back into port to refit the ship, change out the crew. You say to the captain, "Can I have my pay now?" Bear in mind that he has your immigration papers, so you can't prove to anybody that you ever came into the country legally, even if you had. And the captain looks at you and says, "I'm Thai, you're Cambodian, you're in my country illegally, I don't have to pay you, go away." Now worse off than you were 4 years ago, you go around desperately trying to find employment. Eventually someone says, "Okay, I'll pay you if you come work for me." You go to that person's shop, you get drugged, and get put on another boat for 3 more years. That's trafficking, that's a form of slavery, and yes, this scenario actually happened to a guy. I'm not making this up. Being trafficked is a terrible thing, where people lose control of their life experience for a period of time. There was another case not long ago where an individual got on a boat and no one knew where he was. And when he got back to Burma, he found his wife had moved on, had actually borne another child by another man because she thought he was dead. There was a story from the UN offices, this one comes through Mekong Club, about Ong and his new bride Maya, who traveled from Myanmar, that's Burma, to Thailand in search for work. They had no money, so they accepted what they had been led to believe was a free ride to Bangkok. 4 hours into the journey, the van suddenly stopped and Maya was pulled out. Ong said, "What are you doing with my wife?" And the trafficker said, "Well, you didn't pay us for the ride, so we're taking her. She belongs to us now. You owe us money." The traffickers beat Ong unconscious. He woke up on a fishing boat. After 4 years, he escaped, came to the UN offices because he was looking for his wife, his newlywed wife, whom he had lost. And she had presumably been taken off to a brothel somewhere. And this was just one of those terrible case scenarios where anybody who could see the guy could tell that he was dearly in love, and his only thought on the boat must have been to find his wife and reunite. And it didn't happen. This is the tragedy of human trafficking. Many, many lives are destroyed as a result of this injustice. And it's estimated that about 1 in 3 of all Thai fishing boats are essentially slave ships. The Thai government knows this. They have the satellite technology to track these boats, but the political will is lacking to put any real effort into stopping this crime. And this is a very important point. Governments have the power to stop many forms of human trafficking. They don't invest the time, energy, and resources because too few people care enough to make them. Trafficking happens because we let it happen. And of course, this is just one industry. People get locked into similar situations in factories, construction sites, agriculture, and even ordinary households as domestic servants, just to name some of the more common arenas. Oh, prostitution, of course, as well. In the next case, you're a person traveling from Laos. You go to a Thai construction site, and you say, I'd like a job. And the construction manager says, fine, yes, I'll give you a job, but I can't pay you for the first 2 months. Well, it isn't like you have an abundance of options. The pay he promises is pretty good. So you agree to work for 14 to 15 hours a day in hazardous conditions. 3 months go by, 2 months go by, and you say, okay, can I have my pay now? And the boss says, oh, well, sorry, I can't pay you for another 2 months. Just wait. And he gives you some excuse about accounts payable outstanding. Something seems reasonable. But this goes on for 2 months, 2 months, 2 months, until eventually you feel like, well, it doesn't look like I'm ever going to get paid, but if I leave, then I'm certainly not going to get paid. And so you become more anxious and rambunctious. You spend all this time away from home. You have nothing to show for it. And eventually what happens, you get into confrontation with the foreman over how he's treating you. The police are called. They arrest you. They deport you. The construction manager gets a year of free labor from you. That's trafficking. That's another form of slavery. Next story, you cross over from Burma to Thailand. You find a factory near the ocean and ask, can I get a job here? And the owner says, yeah, you can have a job, but you can't leave the factory. You have to stay in the factory all the time. But we'll pay you $50 a month, which is a lot of money for a Burmese person like yourself. You're thrilled. You sign whatever papers they push at you, not knowing what they say because you can't read Thai. You go inside the factory, you work 13, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. At the end of 2 months, you go to the boss and say, can I have my money now? And the factory owner says, oh, well, according to your contract here, all of your costs end up adding up to $54 to keep you here. You owe me money. It's an outrageous scam, and it happens all the time. You have indentured situations like this where the more people work, the further they fall into debt because of the ridiculous hidden costs that their exploiters impose. So they're trapped in this hellish cycle for anywhere from months to years until either someone frees them, they escape, they get killed, they get deported, they're finally set loose because either the job's done or they're too worn out or hurt to be of use as a slave. This is trafficking. This is another form of slavery. Moving on to the exploitation of children. Imagine you are the daughter of a struggling family in Cambodia. And one day, someone you trust, a relative or community member, comes to your parents and says, let me take your child to the city. I'll see to it that she gets a good job as a house servant. She'll work part of the day, go to school, and if she does well, she can even send her extra earnings back home. Everybody wins. Your parents jump at the opportunity. They have debts to pay and a lot of kids that they can't feed or clothe properly. You feel grateful for this arrangement because you want to help your family and to go to school. What really happens? You get taken to somebody's house. You work from 6 in the morning until 11 at night. You take care of the meals. You take care of the kids. You clean, do the laundry. You aren't allowed out of the house. You never go to school. And if the man of the house wants to abuse you sexually, there's nothing you can do about it. If that happens and the woman of the home finds out about it, she may think that you're instigating the attention, and she'll express her jealousy through vicious beatings and a generally spiteful attitude towards you. Since you're staying in the home, your living costs are subtracted from what you were supposed to get paid. So where at first you thought you would make $30 a month to send home, you only get $5 or $1, if anything at all. When you finally do get back, your parents are furious with you because most or all the money they expected never arrived, and they have already been told a pack of lies about your behavior. They've heard that you were a lazy worker, that you broke things, stole stuff, did poorly in school, that sort of thing. And your own parents might not believe your side of the story because they just can't conceive of people being that awful. That's trafficking. That's another form of slavery. Continuing with child labor. Let's jump briefly to West Africa. Anyone realize that much of the chocolate you eat is made using illegal child labor? The United Nations has documented that there are thousands and thousands of children working in dangerous conditions on cocoa plantations right now. A very large percentage of them fit the definition of trafficked slave labor. What does this form of exploitation look like? Well, let's say that you're a 10-year-old boy and your parents have indentured you to work on a cocoa farm so that they can pay off a debt. Now, we tell our kids not to run with scissors, but you're given a machete to hack your way through the jungle. So you have scars crisscrossing your legs where you've hit yourself. You mix and apply pesticide chemicals without any protective gear. You sometimes have to climb way up into the trees with no safety equipment to get at the cocoa beans. And then you get to lug 13-pound sacks of these beans across your back for long distances to a collection point. And over the time, these loads cause hernias and shoulder wounds. Does any of this sound like something you want a child doing? All the while, you aren't going to school. You're probably not being fed properly. And because you have no recourse to justice, the foremen feel at liberty to beat you, to keep you working from dawn until dusk. In the meantime, in time, you have enough of these brutal conditions. You try to run away. Unfortunately, the plantation owners catch you. They hunt you down and catch you. They bring you back. And to make an example of you, the boss takes you out in front of the other slaves and beats you. This is human trafficking and another form of slavery. Now, one of the absolute most abhorrent abuses of children is the use of them as child soldiers. Now, I heard about Coney before the Coney 2012 campaign came out, and everything in that famous video is in line with what I'd already learned. What does this look like? You're walking on the outskirts of your village. Some people with guns come along and say that you have just joined their army. And to secure your loyalty, they make you kill somebody in your own village. So now you're a murderer, and you can never go back home. If you're a male, they teach you that it's okay to treat women like slaves and force yourself on them whenever you want. If you are a girl, you can imagine what you're in for. These groups typically use rape as a weapon to terrorize their enemies. The leaders who perpetuate this cycle of violence need to be removed from society, and their victims require intensive help. And according to the U.S. State Department's 2013 Trafficking in Persons report, child soldiers have been found in Burma, Central African Republic, Chad, Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. The problem is that these places typically don't have many resources to trade with the Western world, so few people care about them. There's very little political will to do anything serious about these atrocities. State-sponsored slavery has been around since the dawn of civilization and is still very common in modern times. For example, the Japanese Empire had at least 100,000 comfort women during World War II, possibly as many as 400,000. Some of them were there by choice, but it's well documented that many were not. And this photo is of some Korean nationals who were liberated shortly after the war. The man to the side would be a U.S. soldier assigned to take care of them. You can see that those women have not been doing very well. Speaking of state slavery, North Korea, easily qualifies as one big slave state, and they have a lot of very notorious re-education camps to make life a literal hell for well over 100,000 political prisoners. And we know this from satellite imagery and the stories of refugees who make it out to friendly countries. Okay, sex trafficking is such a complex and unique issue that it really deserves its own separate lecture. It's the area of modern slavery that I have the most passion for. And that has to do with how violence and sexual abuse has directly affected some people that I've known in my life. So if you have questions about sex trafficking and prostitution, I can tell you quite a lot about this issue after the presentation. What does sex trafficking look like? Here is a worst case scenario. In this story, you start out as a 12-year-old girl named Maria in Honduras. To begin with, you get raped by a group of men in your village and become pregnant. Because you are so poor, you leave your newborn with your mother and go out to find some way of making money. You get to the border of a neighboring country where you meet a group of men who say that they'll broker you a job in a factory. You agree. Shortly after you cross the border, however, the traffickers take away your papers and sell you to a brothel. Now, most women and girls who are forced into prostitution must have their wills broken first. They call this process by many ugly names: induction, initiation, taming, or breaking in as though the girl were a pair of shoes. You scream at them, "No, no, no, I won't do all these horrible things you say." And so to convince you to do what they want, they bring in 3, 4, 5, or 8 guys. They gang rape and beat you for as many days as necessary. One day, another day, until you agree to serve as Johns. And this is not sensationalizing. This is how it's done. Then they tell you that you'll remain in this hell until you've paid off your cell price in full. At the first opportunity, you run away to a local police station. The police take you straight back to the brothel, where you are again brutalized and raped for trying to flee. You realize too late that the police are providing protection for the criminals. They extort money from the brothel keepers and get free services from the girls whenever they want. Desperately hating your situation, you try to run away once more. And this time you're found by the Army, who at that time they realize that you don't have any immigration papers and haul you back to the border. As soon as you walk across the bridge to the other side, you are picked up again by the same group of traffickers who caught you in the first place. You're taken back to the brothel, they double your imposed debt, and after yet another session of gang rapes and beatings, you lose all hope of escaping. By this point in your story, you are a helpless 16-year-old girl with absolutely no recourse to justice. Every night you give your small body up to be violated by men who never think to ask how you got where you are. They assume that you're like the other prostitutes in the trade to make some money. In fact, there are Johns who believe that it is, quote, a very unusual man indeed, only one extreme feminists believe exist, who will stand in line to be with an unwilling, scared girl as young as you. And yes, a John said that to me. What they don't consider is that you have had your acting skills literally beaten into you. Now you compete with all the, quote, voluntary prostitutes to meet your quota. Failure means a punishment you'd rather not contemplate, and survival requires that you hide your fear. The only reason we even know of your story is because one night you meet a John who is different. He refuses your advances. He disarms you by actually asking you about yourself. And sensing that perhaps he cares something for you, you tell him the truth of your story. And afterward he dances with you a little bit, pays you for your time, and gives you a warm hug before he leaves. You never learn that he is an undercover investigator going by the name of Daniel Walker, and that he is recording everything you say on a hidden camera. Very sadly, however, a raid to rescue you gets aborted due to corruption, and so far as we know, you never get out, and we don't know the fate of your impoverished mother and child back home. And just in case there is any question, yes, Maria's story really happened. I've spoke with Daniel myself about it, and you can read more details in his book, God in a Brothel. In the U.S., we often see traffickers recruiting vulnerable girls into prostitution using coercive lover boy approaches. And this is what happened to a 16-year-old girl named Emily. Shortly after coming to the U.S. from Puerto Rico, her mother died, and she was left on her own. A pimp named Steve saw Emily's situation and stepped in. At first, he showered her with reassurance, affection, and gifts. And then he used the emotional attachment he had created in Emily to manipulate and bully her into selling herself at the strip joints, truck stops, and hotels along the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia. In this next story, you were a 13-year-old girl named Melissa. Your Australian father has just committed suicide. Your mother has abandoned you and your 2 younger brothers. And desperate for money and a place to stay, you obtain a false birth certificate and go to work at a go-go bar. You get paid a little less than $3 a night to wear heavy makeup and a bikini from 6 in the evening until 3 in the morning. You have to dance for half an hour on stage and then work the floor for a while, sitting on the knees of men, allowing them to grope and fondle you as they wish. Being a virgin, you know that you are expected to sleep with whomever is willing to pay the $900 price tag for being your first customer. Thankfully, after working only 5 nights, a raid that Daniel helped facilitate gets you out of this situation. And while most of the other women and girls rescued complain that their livelihoods have been disrupted, you are grateful. In fact, you write Daniel a card which he tells us has become a source of inspiration for him. In that card you say, "I wish that you would never be tired of helping such many children like me. I'm so lucky for the opportunity that you gave. Thank you for all the help and support that you have given and shown me. I promise I will try my best to achieve all my goals in life. I'll reach for them. I'll try my best to succeed. I will never forget you, never. The sex industry preys on vulnerable people like Melissa. Of course, the managers and Johns can see that these kids are underage. To hire them on is sex trafficking and a form of slavery, and to sleep with a child such as Melissa is statutory rape. But whether they're 13 or 30, I submit that these vulnerable people don't need Johns to exploit their desperation by exchanging erotic dances and sex for money. They need these men to set aside their selfishness and help get these girls out of abject poverty without accepting sexual favors in return. Some common Nepal, India scenarios. In the 2003 documentary, The Day My God Died, we hear a lot of stories of girls from Nepal who get drugged by somebody and wake up in a brothel in India. And from the mighty Nepal shelter, we also hear the next story happening a lot. A man will show up in a Nepalese village. He flashes some money around, says that he wants a wife. He befriends a family with a pretty teenage daughter and actually marries the girl. And then he takes her down to Mumbai, India, puts her into a room, and he goes to haggle a price for her. And imagine what it must feel like for her when the brothel madam finally comes in and tells this young lady that she's just been made a slave. Speaking of brides and trafficking, thanks to China's one-child policy, a cultural preference for boys over girls, and the idea that abortion is morally acceptable, the Chinese have killed off several million girls in the womb. And this has led to a massive gender imbalance in China, on the order of 18 million more men than women of marrying age. Where are all these unwed men going to get their wives? Some of them are going to find ladies from the surrounding countries. And these men are at the bottom of the barrel. The decent ones are able to attract spouses, and the rest have to buy them. So now we have a human rights nightmare where girls from North Korea, Vietnam, and others are getting trafficked to become brides. It's quite the object lesson that ideas have consequences. Now, I've seen an advocate for normalizing prostitution say that sex trafficking stories are rare anomalies. But just how many is too many? Just how many of the girls in porn, strip clubs, massage parlors, street corners, brothels, and internet adverts on sites like Backpage are out there out of desperation or against their will? How many of them who are advertised as 18 are actually 16 or 13? How many have had their acting skills literally beaten into them? How many girls are performing because their pimps have threatened to harm them or their families if they don't sell themselves? How many who choose sex work are there because they have no other survivable options? How many are in it who have a history of sexual abuse? I'm surprised that more studies on prostitution don't ask that question. Doesn't anyone think that sex abuse might seriously warp a person's perspective on what healthy sexuality is? At just what price does our society condone commercialized sex? Is prostitution the world's oldest profession? Or is it really the world's oldest oppression? And this deserves much more time than we have. I have a separate slideshow that I brought along if any of you would like to cover it once we've finished our official time here. I will say that at the heart of all the pro-legitimization arguments is the idea that prostitution is a victimless crime between consenting adults. That assertion, however, begs several questions. Is the significant other whom the John is cheating on not a victim? Is the future partner of a John whom he exposes to venereal diseases not a victim? Are the family members who will not benefit from the money being spent on the prostitute not victims? Are the taxpayers who must shoulder the added medical costs for treating the spread of disease through the sex industry not victims? And finally, are we so sure that the prostituted person is not, in fact, a victim? Are we sure that he or she is really even an adult? And even if they are, how do we know for sure that they are really consenting? And finally, there is the unavoidable fact that if there were no sex industry to hide behind, sex trafficking for profit could not exist. No demand, no supply.